Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. This is also a podcast that believes the Epstein files should be released and can really only think of one reason why someone with a long, close personal history with Jeffrey Epstein would promise over and over while running for president that he would release all Epstein files, only to immediately reverse course once elected president and now insist on keeping everything secret and refusing to release anything. But as I said, this is a podcast about Florida politics. So I want to start today with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who made some news yesterday when he flew first to Broward County, which is in South Florida, which is where the city of Fort Lauderdale is, and then to the city of Gainesville in North Florida. This is where the University of Florida is in kind of North Florida. And he had with him his new handpicked chief financial officer, a former Republican state senator by the name of Blaise Ingoglia. Ron DeSantis had Blaise Ingoglia in tow with him for this, where at these two stops, he announced that he was launching a series of Doge-style audits of some local governments, or some cities and counties around Florida that he claims have been spending money frivolously and on wasteful expenses and when they should be cutting taxes and sort of following his lead instead. It's a pretty funny thing for him to be sort of boasting about his leadership in these areas because he's targeting places where he is genuinely loathed by local voters. So just to give you an example, in Broward County, where he was yesterday, and Alachua County, which is where the city of Gainesville is, Ron DeSantis got 42% of the vote in the 2022 election. Remember, that was an election he won handily. So this is a couple of communities that want nothing to do with Ron DeSantis style leadership. And of course, it's obviously no secret that these Doge style audits, the audits that he's now launching, are targeting blue areas in particular. As this is very clearly about sort of trying to make political points rather than any kind of legitimate good faith, scrutiny. But the reason I bring all this up is not actually about the sort of the audits themselves. It was something the governor said while announcing this stuff and kind of thumping his chest about the importance of transparency and sort of what do these local governments have to hide. Because so the backstory here is a little bit of the backstory is that the governor's office requested a whole pile of documents and records from cities and counties across the state a while back. And the governor says a number of them refused to turn over a bunch of the records his administration was seeking. And the reason he's able to now kind of like launch these more aggressive audits is he got the legislature, amid all the fights we've talked about in Florida this year, the legislature agreed to give him some new powers essentially like basically a hammer with which he can sort of like make sure local governments turn over more information to him for this Doge style process. I can't believe we're talking about Doge. It feels like we're like 3 months behind on this. I mean, it was so wild in one of these press conferences. Ron DeSantis even mentioned both Donald Trump and modeling Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and it's sort of like, my guy, has anybody told you about what's going on between those two guys? I feel like the time for this political moment may have passed, my friend. But anyway, during this press conference in Broward County, the governor again was noting that a number of local governments, and including Broward County, had refused to turn over a bunch of the records he'd asked for originally, and he was holding that up as an example of as evidence that they have something to hide. And he said, here's what he said exactly. I jotted down this quote because I wanted to read it. But he said, quote, "My view would be you should be proud of what you're doing and proud of your budgeting and your spending, that you should welcome this stuff to be able to trumpet that to your constituency." Essentially saying that the only reason you wouldn't turn over documentation, the only reason you wouldn't let the public review your records is if you had something to hide, which is pretty fucking ironic coming from this governor who is right now quite literally trying to hide his tracks on the more than $250 million in spending he's already approved for this new rushed immigrant detention camp that he's built in the middle of the Florida Everglades. This is the immigrant detention facility that's got this new sociopathic nickname, Alligator Alcatraz. A number of reporters, myself included, and others, have been trying to track the records in this because, as we've talked about on this podcast before, This is a facility that has been rushed into construction, built in 8 days, using a bunch of vendors who've been thrown money on no bid contracts that the governor's been able to do because he's operating under a nearly 3-year-old state of emergency that allows him to bypass like bidding laws and do like I said no bid contracts, allows him to rush all this stuff out the door with like minimal levels of scrutiny. So a number of us have been trying to piece together who's getting what business and how much is really being spent. And in recent weeks, we have found now at least $250 million worth of contracts that the DeSantis administration has approved just in the last couple of weeks related to this Alligator Alcatraz immigrant detention facility in the middle of the Everglades, right? And so all of these contracts and documents related to these are required by law to be posted online. The state has this database of contracts and purchase orders. This is in statute. You agencies have to put stuff up there. It's part of a system that is designed under a law that's actually called Transparency Florida is the name of the statute it's under, right? And so even we've talked on this podcast a lot before about how the DeSantis administration has essentially gutted the state's public records law by just refusing to comply with it, by taking records requests and sitting on them for not just months at a time, but years at a time, and often refusing to even fulfill anything until there's actual litigation that compels him to. So he hasn't been able to get around this because by law, these documents have to go up on this site that's publicly available. So a number of us, a number of reporters, a number of activists, a number of people have been pulling contracts and purchase orders down off this site to sort of prove just how much spending is going out there. And you're already starting to prove a bunch of lies. There have been contracts that have shown, for instance, the DeSantis administration has said repeatedly that they're not like paving over new ground in the Everglades here, that they're just using this existing airfield. These records show, for instance, that there has been paving. They have built a new road as part of they bought new asphalt and stuff in this. Exposing these records have been, like I said, useful to exposing actual lies that are coming about this facility, in addition to showing you how much is being shoveled out the door in like record time, which vendors are getting, many of which has been well documented by other journalists, are major donors to the Republican Party of Florida, the governor, and others involved in this. James Uthmeyer, the state's attorney general. Anyway, we've been pulling these contracts. Just to give you an example, they're showing, for instance, that some of these jobs are being paid almost $200 an hour. It's just crazy amounts of spending. And so we've been pulling these contracts. And last week, the DeSantis administration started removing these contracts from this database, pulling them down, taking them out. Again, by law, they are required to post them. And they pulled them all down. And then after 3 days of outrage, they put scrubbed versions back up where they essentially stripped almost all detail from them. They're essentially just putting up cover pages now in this website, which if you were proud of your spending, my view would be you should be proud of what you're doing and proud of what you're spending and putting these contracts up for the world to see. But instead, the DeSantis administration is hiding them. Yet here he is going around claiming that a bunch of local governments are the ones trying to do suspicious spending and trying to hide from taxpayers. He's the guy. Everything with this guy is projection, and it's really wild in that, the DeSantis administration basically doesn't answer questions from most reporters, but actually a conservative outlet, the Reason Foundation, wrote a really good story. I'll throw a link to the show notes in this. They actually pressed them on this and got the DeSantis administration to claim that the reason they pulled these records is because they have trade secrets in them. They do not. They absolutely do not have trade secrets. And credit to the Reason Foundation for pointing out, like, they asked, give us an example of the kinds of trade secrets that are in these records. And the DeSantis administration refused to answer that question. They are hiding behind this. And one reason we know there's not trade secrets in there is we do have all the records that they did initially post before they pulled them all down. I actually wrote a piece on the newsletter this weekend where I just posted all the stuff that's been removed, just so folks had links to some of these original documents, even though new contracts going up don't have the same level of detail for now. We do at least have these old ones. So you want to take a look at how exactly they're spending your money. The governor is spending your money on this immigration prison camp in the middle of the Everglades. You can find out on it. I'll throw that into the show notes too. And If you were serious about wanting to audit profligate spending, irresponsible, wasteful spending, another place you might look is the Attorney General's office, where we learned this week that James Uthmeyer using taxpayer money to pay lawyers nearly $900 an hour to defend himself in a case where he's been found in contempt of court. I think we've alluded to this in another podcast, but there is a challenge brought by an immigrants' rights groups against a state law that a federal judge has enjoined the state law, essentially ruling that it is a constitutional attempt by the state to enforce to do immigration law, which is an area reserved to the federal government, a violation of the supremacy clause. James Uthmeyer openly defied the federal court on this and boasted about it on law, and eventually got found in contempt of court on this, and is now having to comply with a bunch of stuff. But anyway, in this case, the attorney general has hired the law firm Boies Schiller Flexner, which is actually a really famous law firm. I think it's probably best known as the firm that was like representing the federal government in the Microsoft antitrust case in the late 90s, early 2000s, that landmark antitrust case. James Uthmeyer is paying their attorneys up to $875 an hour to defend himself in this lawsuit, in this case, challenging the state's law, which he is now also appealing his contempt of court ruling. That's an insane number for a government to be paying attorneys, right? Particularly these like high powered attorneys, right? If you want to go after government spending, maybe go after that. That's another one, by the way. We have access to contracts because they get posted online, right? Also, coincidentally enough, this is the same law firm that the DeSantis administration has hired to defend Alligator Alcatraz in court. So there's a lawsuit going now that has been brought by. There's a number of lawsuits going, but the main one has been brought by a number of environmental groups, essentially urging to have the site either shut down or at least halted as is right now, arguing that the federal government has violated the construction of it violated federal rules regarding it basically violated environmental laws, which which is sort of important when you're building something in the middle of the Everglades, one of the most sensitive ecosystems on the planet, a place where we have spent literally tens of billions of dollars trying to restore over the last 25 years or so. In this case, the DeSantis administration has hired Boies Schiller to defend that lawsuit. So this one law firm is not only defending James Uthmeyer's contempt of court and this state immigration law, it is also defending literally an immigrant prison camp in the middle of the Everglades, this black hole prison where they've been locking people up, many of whom, by the way, the Miami Herald has found in some unbelievably great reporting, many of whom have no criminal record whatsoever. And another thing that adds to this, that makes this Doge stuff just so hypocritical and just like monstrously hypocritical, is, as we've mentioned before, and I think I alluded to earlier on this podcast, all of this Alligator Alcatraz stuff has been able to happen because the governor is essentially abusing his emergency powers. In January 2023, he called a state of emergency due to illegal immigration. And once you declare a state of emergency, the governor gets access to all sorts of additional legal powers. He's got the ability to suspend various state laws. This is why they're able to rush out no bid contracts. They don't have to comply with procurement laws. We mentioned on an earlier podcast, they've gone so far as to suspend laws requiring background checks for the people working as prison guards at this immigrant detention facility in the Everglades. He's used these emergency powers to actually seize the land from this. This land belonged to Miami-Dade County, a local government. The governor, the DeSantis administration, seized this land using its emergency powers under this illegal immigration state of emergency that, again, he declared in January 2023. Or now, 2.5 years later, he still has the state of Florida locked in this state of emergency, so he can continue using all these emergency powers and ignoring laws that might be inconvenient to him. Now, one of the few safeguards around the governor's emergency powers is there's a state law in place, and I'll throw a link to it in the show notes, that requires, if a state of emergency goes beyond 1 year, the auditor general is supposed to conduct a financial audit of literally all associated expenditures and all associated contracts entered into this declared emergency. So you remember all these contracts that the governor is trying to hide right now? They're supposed to be being audited by the auditor general right now. This emergency, like I said, this state of emergency is now in its third year. And yet, not a single audit has happened. This was Jeff Schweers, the Orlando Sentinel, reported this a couple of weeks ago. The Auditor General hasn't done any audit as required by this. So it's just basically concluded that it was too hard to comply with, so we just didn't do it. And yet again, here we have the governor going around the state to blue areas claiming that these county commissioners and city commissioners are trying to hide their spending when literally he is hiding his spending. He's ignoring profligate spending by his own allies, and he is not getting subject to the audits he is supposed to be going through himself. This is just unbelievably. It is awful from a taxpayer's perspective because all this stuff should be getting scrutinized by auditors and the public, and it is just the amount of, like I said, hypocrisy that goes into a guy who can stand there with a straight face and talk about how if you've got nothing to hide, you should welcome some oversight and public transparency, when we are dealing with, again, I've been doing this 25 years, by orders of magnitude, the least transparent governor we have ever had in this state. You know, one other story I wanted to talk about that kind of ties into to like essentially a guy with a lot of public bravado who's actually hiding from public scrutiny. He's a bit of a coward when it comes to his own sort of laundry. Is a story we haven't written about on the newsletter, I don't think, since it happened, but it involves a new state law that piece of legislation the legislature passed this session. We have talked about this expanded non-compete laws in Florida. Basically, this was a bill, and I'll throw this story into the show notes, but we found public records that showed this was a piece of legislation that was literally written by lobbyists for a billionaire hedge fund manager, and it gives companies in Florida the power to lock some employees into much longer and stronger non-compete agreements. And non-compete agreements, of course, are terrible for workers. They inhibit the ability of people to move among competitors. They inhibit the ability of people to launch and start their own companies. Non-compete agreements are some of the most anti-worker things you could do. And the Florida legislature just passed a law making it even easier for companies to bind workers to companies in Florida to bind workers to non-compete agreements. And again, a law that public records show conclusively was literally written by lobbyists for this billionaire hedge fund manager who is notorious for trying to enforce non-compete agreements, by the way. Anyway, so this law passed the legislature this session, and it came to Ron DeSantis. And so here's this big and tough governor talks about says he's always looking out for the little guy. He's faced with this obviously anti-worker piece of legislation that would expand non-compete agreements. So, ironic at a time when other states around the country, including Republican states, are going the direction of eliminating non-compete agreements because they realize just how horrible this is for workers, how horrible it is for innovation, for economic development. So the governor's faced with this. So it's a terrible bill for workers, but it's also a big priority for a billionaire donor who's one of his biggest donors. This is the billionaire hedge fund manager, the guy by the name of Ken Griffin, who is moved to Florida a couple of years ago and is immediately just shattered campaign contribution records in this state. He gave something like $30 million in campaign contributions during the 2024 elections alone. This is just one guy doing this, including I'll throw a story with the exact numbers in it, but I want to say it was like $12 million just to the anti-marijuana campaign, the anti-Amendment 3 campaign that was so personally important to the Ron DeSantis. Also $4 million each to the House Speaker and the Senate President. This guy is throwing around money in a way that we have not seen before. So here you got Ron DeSantis with a bill that's really genuinely bad for workers, but is also really important for one of the biggest donors in the state. What did he do? He just looked the other way and allowed it to become law without his signature. This is the coward's way of signing a piece of legislation. Normally, a governor either signs a bill or vetoes it, in which case it doesn't become law. But he does have this third option where he just doesn't do anything, and after enough time passes, it becomes law without his signature. Ron DeSantis, again, a guy who fancies himself a tough guy, had never done this before until this bill. He turned the other way and allowed it to become law. So this is functionally, this is the exact same thing as him signing the bill himself, but without actually having to put his name on a piece of paper to it. So this is exactly how a coward kowtows to billionaires, right? And again, another sign of a guy who just is looking to evade public scrutiny wherever he can. Well, in this case, literally doing a favor for a billionaire. So anyway, It's an interesting time in Florida. It'd be really great if the Florida legislature, which made so much noise about reasserting some of its independence, actually exerted some oversight, some legitimate oversight around this stuff specifically. I think it has not happened. In fact, as I think we've talked about, it's instead of Republican legislators in the legislature, instead of like looking out for taxpayers, they've been kind of like ghoulishly fanboying over this Alligator Alcatraz. We see them showing up and taking pictures at the grand opening as if it was some sort of like red carpet movie premiere. But the reality is taxpayers are getting fleeced on this stuff, and the governor is doing everything he can to cover his tracks on this. And now he's launching this Doge thing to try and make it seem like to distract from his own reckless spending being done in the shadows, and trying to pretend that, like, hey, the real bad guys here, the people we ought to be paying attention to are these Democratic cities and counties around the state. It is utterly naked what is happening here. The question is just, is there literally anybody in a position of power in the legislature or any other branch of government to do anything about it? So, all right, we're gonna leave the show there for this week. We'll hopefully be back again next week. In the meantime, if you haven't already, please think about signing up for the newsletter, seekingrentsfl.com. It's the easiest place to find us. And then also just be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. And if you got any thoughts, leave a comment or review too. All right, take care. We'll talk again soon.